Some things are best left forgotten. But the truth is still out there, lingering like a shadow. This is the story of a place where darkness bled into the light. A place where something unnatural watched from the trees. It happened a few years ago when we decided to leave the city behind, to escape into the quiet of the countryside. But there's nothing peaceful about what we found. We thought we'd found our escape. A quiet farm in the middle of nowhere. My stepmom dreamed of living off the land, growing our own food, raising animals, being self-sufficient. After a few failed attempts, we finally found the perfect house with a rundown asparagus farm and acres of land. It felt right. At first, we brought in chickens, ducks, rabbits. Life began to feel like it was falling into place. But something was off. One morning, 2 of our adult ducks were gone. No feathers, no blood, not a single trace. It was as if they had vanished without a whisper. We told ourselves they had wandered off, but deep down, we knew something wasn't right. How could they just disappear, like smoke in the wind? It was a rainy evening when we heard it. One of the ducks, a soft, lonely quack echoing from the woods. We rushed outside, desperate to find something, anything to explain it. We split up, with my dad and brother heading toward the creek, guns in hand, just in case. My stepmom and I followed the tree line, but as we neared the woods, something froze us in place. Whistles. A faint, high-pitched whistle coming from deep in the forest. It wasn't the ducks. It wasn't even the wind. It was deliberate. My stepmom and I looked at each other, confused. We thought it was my brother. But when we called out, my dad and brother came running from the opposite side of the property, asking why we were whistling. The whistle hadn't come from us. And yet, there was no one there. No movement. Just the eerie sound cutting through the air. And then, silence. Days later, another incident, one I didn't witness, but my brother and sister did. A storm was rolling in, the sky darkening. And in the distance, just beyond the fence, they saw him. A man, crouched in the woods, dressed all in white. My brother, quick as ever, fired a shot into the air, shouting at the man to leave. But the figure didn't answer. He just disappeared. My sister later told me something that made my blood run cold. She said the man wasn't just in white. He had a glow around him. An unnatural, otherworldly glow. Something that shouldn't be possible in the pitch black night. My brother didn't see it at first, but she did. And when the man vanished into the woods, that light, it lingered, hanging in the air like a curse. We never went into the woods again. After that, my parents made it clear. We were never to set foot in that part of the property. The ducks were gone. The man was gone. But something had changed. The land was no longer just a peaceful farm. It had become something else. A place where something unseen, something terrifying, lurked just beyond the trees, watching, waiting. And to this day I wonder, were we just imagining it all? Or was there something truly out there, in the woods? Something waiting for us to come too close? I don't know. But if you ever hear a whistle in the distance, or see a man glowing in the darkness, don't make the mistake of going after it. Some things are best left undisturbed. It was about 5 years ago, when I was 26. I had just graduated from college, drowning in debt and struggling to find work. Every job I applied for, I was either underqualified or overqualified. I was stuck in a small town in Washington, suffocating in loneliness and confusion. That's when I decided to leave. A friend of mine, someone I hadn't seen in years, suggested I try woofing. Volunteer on a farm, work 25 hours a week, and in exchange, they give you food and a roof over your head. It was cheap and, more importantly, escapism. I needed to escape. So I packed my bags, left everything behind, and began my journey. The thrill of being on the road, surrounded by strangers, people living off the land, gave me a glimmer of hope. It was an opportunity to reset, figure things out. But this? What happened next? I wasn't prepared for any of it. 8 months later, after shoveling cow manure in Washington, Oregon, and California, I had a bit of cash saved up. I wanted more. I wanted an adventure. So I went to a randomizer website. I clicked the Choose a Destination button, and it chose Georgia. The screen fills with a swirling vortex as the narrator spins a wheel of random locations. The wheel stops on Georgia, and the scene shifts to dark, isolated roads. I landed in Tbilisi, Georgia, and from there, I barely made it. The roads were a mess, full of crumbling Soviet-era buses and taxis that seemed like they had been abandoned decades ago. It took me 20 hours of nerve-wracking travel through winding hills and broken paths. Then finally, I reached the destination. And let me tell you, that mountain, it felt wrong. There was nothing but trees, thick and oppressive, suffocating the silence. No sign of life. When I finally reached the farm, I thought it was abandoned. The house, half crumbling, overgrown with ivy, looked like something out of a nightmare. There was a man standing in front of it, though. He smiled too wide, his teeth almost glowing in the dim light. His name was Eerie. He led me around the property, showing me the farm. But the whole time, I had this nagging feeling like I was being watched by something I couldn't see. I asked about his family, his wife, his kids, and he brushed me off. Said they were away, busy, but I didn't believe him. The place looked abandoned, rotting apple trees, a barn whose roof had collapsed. The house reeked of mold and decay. This wasn't a farm. It was a forgotten place, a place left to rot. But I stayed. I had nowhere else to go, and my exhaustion was taking over. I ate the meal Eerie made me, though every bite felt heavy, like I was being swallowed by something unseen. That night, I woke up to a sound, a dragging noise. It was soft at first, but it kept going. Something heavy and metallic, scraping across the wooden floor, echoing through the silence of the house. I thought I was imagining it, but the noise got louder, closer. My heart raced as I lay frozen in bed. I couldn't move. After what felt like an eternity, it stopped. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't. Something wasn't right. The next morning, Eerie was different. His eyes were darker, more sunken. He avoided my gaze. He asked me to fix some windows and doors while he went to the nearby village for supplies. I did, but something was off. The house felt more like a tomb than a home. Broken furniture, old photos scattered across the floor. It was as if no one had lived there for years. The air was thick with dust and decay. I pulled out my phone and checked the listing again. The pictures didn't match. This wasn't the same house. And then I saw them. 3 men walking up the hill toward the house. No paths, no roads. Just 3 figures, moving slowly, purposefully. I panicked. I ran behind the house and scrambled down the steep hill into the thick forest below. I hid behind a bush, trying to keep as still as possible. The men were coming closer, their footsteps heavy and deliberate. I waited and waited. Hours seemed to pass, but finally, they left. When I thought I was safe, I ran. I didn't stop until I reached the road. and after what felt like forever, a car finally stopped. But it wasn't Giri. It wasn't them. It was a kind family who took me to the nearest town. I never heard from Giri again. The listing for the farm disappeared the next day. Some people laugh and say I overreacted, that Giri and his friends were just visiting. But deep down, I know what I felt, what I experienced. Something was wrong with that place. I never went back to Georgia. I never will. There was a time, years ago, when I lived with my aunt, uncle, and older siblings in a house far from anyone else. Our home stood isolated, swallowed by an endless pasture. The kind of place you never leave because there's no one around to help you if something goes wrong. And there was something wrong with that land. Something wrong with the old abandoned cabin that sat alone in the middle of it all. My uncle? He wasn't one to just tell normal stories. He told stories about the land, stories about people who had lived there long before us. But one night, he told me a story about the cabin. And that one, well, it still haunts me. I could barely get through it. That cabin used to belong to a farmer and his young daughter. They were alone out there. The man worked the land every day. And his daughter, a little girl with dark hair and bright eyes, would play around the farm. But one day, something horrible happened. The man was working his tractor, trying to harvest the crops, when he saw his daughter playing nearby. He tried to yell, but it was too late. The machine roared to life, and in an instant, her life was taken. It wasn't an accident. It was a nightmare that would never leave that land. My brother Robert was never afraid of anything. Big guy, strong guy, muscles. No one could scare him. But this story would be the one thing that would break him. One weekend, he decided to take some of his friends out to the cabin. They thought it was time to clean it up, make it useful again, like it was some kind of project. But they didn't know what had happened there, what still lingers there. It started just like any other camping trip. Laughter, shouting, the normal nonsense. But when the sun dipped below the horizon, something changed. As they were getting ready to sleep, Robert stayed up longer than the rest. And that's when he heard it. A faint sobbing from outside. At first, he thought it was nothing. Coyotes, maybe, but the crying, it wouldn't stop. He lay there in that old bed, staring into the darkness, listening to that sobbing, growing louder. And then the scream. It cut through the night, sharp, full of pain. Robert sat up, heart pounding, but it wasn't just the sound. It was her. There, at the foot of his bed, stood a little girl. Her body twisted and covered in cuts. Her long, dark hair hung over her face like some kind of shroud. And the crying. It was endless, broken, like she was in agony. And there was nothing he could do to stop it. Robert said he couldn't even see her face. The cuts, deep, ugly wounds, covered her skin. And her crying made his stomach turn. It wasn't just sad. It was horrific. Like the girl was begging for help, but no one could hear her. When Robert and his friends finally ran back to the house, they were a mess, sweating, gasping for air, eyes wide with terror. Robert, who never cried, was crying now. His friends? Silent, like they had seen something they could never explain. And me? I had never heard him like that before. So, the next day, I told him the story my uncle had told me. The one about the farmer and his daughter. I think that's when it hit him. That cabin wasn't just some abandoned shack. It was cursed. And the girl? She was never going to rest. But the horrors weren't done yet. Not by a long shot. There was another experience. Another night that will never leave me. Our farm was huge. Endless rows of corn. And most days, Robert and I stayed close to the house. But sometimes, we'd venture into the fields. One day, we decided to go deeper than ever before. We were after the creek that ran along the far edge of the property. A place we rarely visited because it was just so far out there. But on that day, something was different. As we walked, we stepped out of the thick corn into a clearing. It shouldn't have been there. This space in the middle of a cornfield, with the stalks surrounding it like a wall. It was too perfect, too unnatural. And that's when we saw them. About 10 men standing in the middle of that clearing. All of them frozen, staring at us with wide, terrified eyes. As if they were caught doing something they shouldn't be. I remember the tension, the silence. And then, one of them stepped forward, like he was going to say something. But we didn't stick around to find out. They were dressed like office workers, not farmers, not out here. They wore button-up shirts and slacks, and the equipment they had set up. It didn't belong on a farm. It looked like something for quick, secretive work. The kind of thing you'd pack up and run with in a hurry. When we ran back to the house, I didn't say a word. Robert didn't say anything either. We couldn't. What we had seen, it didn't make sense. It wasn't real, but it was. When we finally told our dad about it, he didn't believe us, said we'd imagined it. But the next morning, when we went back to the clearing, it was gone. No sign of the men, no sign of the equipment, just the corn, standing still and silent. To this day, my brother and I still don't know what we saw out there. We still don't know what it was, or why it happened. But whatever it was real. Something was watching us, and I have a feeling it's not done watching. Some things, some places, are just cursed. And that cabin, that land, it's never gonna let anyone go.